So now we're going to talk with Christian Boris, a Canadian journalist. He's just arrived from Venezuela. Would you tell us, please, a little bit more about what is going on the streets of Caracas? What have you seen?
So I was there for a very specific time period. It was July 30th that they were having a vote in the country, which would decide the future direction of the country, basically. So people were expecting lots of protests, and there were lots of protests leading up to the event. But the opposition in the country is sort of fractured, and they couldn't build enough momentum to stop what was inevitably going to happen, which a lot of people have called the death of democracy in the country. So the vote passed, which basically installed a new something called a constitutional assembly, which is 545 people chosen from across the country who will be a higher body than the current highest body, the parliament, the National Assembly, which is like the parliament, like the Rada in Ukraine. So basically, the president has created a new institution that is higher than that parliament, which means that the parliament no longer works, essentially. Most countries in Latin America, the United States, Canada, they've all said that they don't recognize this vote. The U.S. has sanctioned the country because of the vote as well. But the day after the vote, there weren't the types of protests that we were expecting to see. And I think a lot of it is because people just became terrified of what the government's new powers are, because they're able to now rewrite the Constitution. And in fact, they actually started arresting opposition politicians after that vote went through. So it's very unclear what the direction of the country is going to be now, how powerful the government is, and what they're willing to do with those powers.
Have you seen some signs of radicalization of this protest? Because we can see pictures of really violent protests, but we don't know if both sides are using forces and violence. We know that the side of police, Maduro forces, they are using violence in the forest. They are killing people and they're wounding them. But what about the other side?
Yeah, they definitely are. When I was there, we were in the very center of downtown, and something very unique happened. There were protesters who set off an IED. It was a fireworks-based IED, so it was basically like fireworks and gasoline, and it went off as a convoy of National Guardsmen on motorcycles passed by. It was very near the Canadian embassy in downtown Caracas, and it exploded. And I think 2 soldiers were burning on fire, and 7 National Guardsmen were wounded total. And there have been reports across the country that protesters have been firing back, because the government authorities have been using live ammunition as well. I mean, that's documented. They have killed over, I believe, 130 people at this point in the last 4 months since it started. Yeah, so I mean, people are dying on both sides, but obviously the government has been doing the bulk of the bulk of the people who have died have been protesters.
But what about those who are supporting Maduro? Have you met them, and what did they tell you?
Yeah, so his approval rating is very low. It's about 20%. Part of the interesting thing that happened for the vote is that in order to get people to vote on that day, we talked to a lot of people who worked at state-run companies who were forced to vote. They said that if you don't vote, you will be fired. And it wasn't really an election. It was rigged, because there was no opposition to vote for. It was candidates who were picked by the president, they were picked by the government to run for those positions. So there were 6,000 people running for 545 spots, but none of those people were people who could represent the opposition in this new body that's been formed. So the people who were voting were really just voting for a new form of the existing government. And like I said, they were people from state-run institutions, the oil and gas company PDVSA, and people were also actually forced to vote in order to get government-provided assistance in the form of food. And I mean, when you're forcing people to vote in order to get food, it's not really a vote. It's exploiting hunger to get them out to do what you want them to do.
So can you please describe us like a daily life in Venezuela right now, because we've read and we've heard about those huge lack of medication and food. How does it feel about how do they feel about this? I mean, have you experienced something like that? Have you seen this lack of products and goods?
Yeah, the number one problem is the lack of medicine. The number two problem is the lack of food, and I think the lack of food is a lot further behind than the lack of medicine, meaning the lack of medicine is critical at this point. I mean, if you need medication in Venezuela, most people can't afford it. 45% of the population doesn't have insurance, and they rely on public hospitals. Those public hospitals are staffed by doctors who have no access to resources. They don't have medication to use. They don't have proper equipment. The hospitals are in horrible condition. We went to a hospital in one of the slums of Caracas, and there was a dog just walking through the hospital, like a stray dog just walked in. There were cockroaches, bugs all around. The people who go to these hospitals are the poorest of the poor. I mean, these are the people who are supposedly being helped by the government, but they don't have any access to medication. So if you get shot in Caracas and you go to the hospital, there's very little that they can do for you, because unless you can afford to bring your own medication, which most people absolutely cannot, the chances are very good that you're not going to make it. If you get diagnosed with a serious disease, I spoke to many, many doctors about this. It wasn't just a couple sources. I mean, it was many, many doctors who said the same thing. Unless you can afford to go to a private clinic, then there's basically no hope for you. And then the lack of food is obviously a problem as well. The thing that most people would probably be surprised by, based on all the reports that they're seeing, is that there is daily life that continues in Caracas. I mean, people still live relatively normal lives, so they can go to restaurants, they can go to grocery stores, if they can afford it. But the vast majority of the population now cannot really afford those things anymore, because the currency has been devalued so much. In the time that I was there, it dropped 60%. And prices have been going up so much that they just don't have money to buy food anymore. And the government does give out handouts, but now those handouts are being highly politicized, and you have to wait in line in order to get those handouts. Those lines can take hours and hours. So the food problem is also at a very bad level, but I think the medicine is at a critical point.
Christian, you've been in Ukraine for a long time. Can you compare these protests in Venezuela and in Ukraine? Maybe is there something similar in these movements?
Being in Venezuela and seeing how many people are actually have actually watched and sort of educated themselves on what was happening in Ukraine and how Maidan was conducted, how protesters used shields and what they were wearing for armor and things like that. It's really, really interesting, because they actually, they're very inspired by what happened in Ukraine, and they've learned a lot from it. I mean, especially young kids, paramedics, stuff like that. They watch documentaries like Winter on Fire. It's really interesting. I think that Venezuela is in a much more critical position than Ukraine was, because people don't have food, because people don't have access to medication, because there's many other threats like murder. I mean, it's the highest rate of murder in the world, kidnapping, old diseases that disappeared a long time ago are now coming back. So I think it's in a much more critical position, but the similarities to Ukraine are kind of astounding.